The Missouri Ozarks in October hold their cold the way the limestone holds everything, quietly, without announcement, until you're already inside it. A woman stands alone on a bluff above a creek that has no interest in her troubles. She carries a canvas sack, $4 silver, a broken tool, and a book with no ending. Behind her, a house she was born in. Ahead, a hillside that hasn't decided yet whether it will kill her or keep her. The wind moves through the scarlet oaks on the ridge. Down in the valley, smoke rises from chimneys she no longer has a right to. Up here, nothing burns. She pushes through a curtain of blood-red vines on the bluff face, steps into the dark, and stops. Because the dark is warm. Not fire warm, not shelter warm. Something older than either. Something the stone has been holding since before anyone thought to ask what stone was capable of keeping. She sets her hand against the wall. Listen. The wind came off the Missouri Ozark Ridges on the 7th of October, 1881, carrying the smell of dying oak leaves and something colder moving behind them. Ren Farrow stood in the yard of her father's homestead outside Caswick, Missouri, holding a canvas sack that contained everything her family had decided she was worth: a hand plane with a cracked sole, a wool blanket worn thin at the corners, a copy of Dana's Manual of Mineralogy missing its back cover, the spine held together by a strip of flour sack cloth she'd wound around it herself 3 winters ago. $4 silver that had been her mother's, kept in a small tin that smelled faintly of the clothes her mother had packed around them for reasons Wren had never thought to ask while there was still time to ask. Everything else in that house, all 40 acres, the livestock, the cured tobacco drying in the barn, the good iron stove, the oak table where 4 generations of Pharaohs had eaten their meals, went to her brother. Her eldest brother, Orville, stood on the porch with his arms folded across a chest that had grown thick with age and the particular self-satisfaction of a man who has mistaken inheritance for achievement. Beside him, Gerald, the middle son, studied the ground with the focused attention of someone who has found that if you look hard enough at dirt, you can convince yourself you don't see what's happening in front of you. Gerald had always been the quiet one, the one who followed Orville's lead not out of agreement, but out of an exhaustion so old it had calcified into something that passed for loyalty. Orville's wife, Lenora, watched from behind the window glass with a thin smile she made no effort to conceal. She had worked toward this outcome for 2 years since Wren's father's health first began its long retreat, and she wore her victory the way certain women wear jewelry they've waited too long to receive, conspicuously, without apology. "You got what's fair," Orville said. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man who has rehearsed his justification until it no longer sounds like one. "The land goes to the ones who work it." Wren had worked it. She'd worked it since she was 9 years old, the same year their mother died of fever, when their father disappeared into whiskey for weeks at a time and left 3 children to manage 40 acres of rocky Missouri hillside. She'd plowed and planted alongside her brothers every season for 19 years. She'd mended fences in February, cold, when her fingers went white and clumsy, mixed feet and when the air in the barn pressed down like a second skin. She'd done all of this, but she was the youngest, the smallest, the one who read books by candlelight instead of playing cards after dark, the one who pressed leaves between the pages of old almanacs and clicked chips from the creek bed and spent entire Sunday afternoons watching a spider rebuild its web after rain. In Orville's estimation, in Lenora's, that made her something less than a real daughter of the land. A reader, a watcher, a waste. She had been a wife, too, until February. Thomas Veth, no relation to the man she would later meet, the world being smaller than maps suggest, had died of a fever that moved through him faster than anything she had medical knowledge to stop. No children. 8 months of grief that had not finished with her yet, though it had changed shape, grown quieter, settled into her bones rather than her throat. Her brothers had given her 6 weeks after Thomas's death before the conversations about the farm's future began. She noticed the timing, she'd said so. "The land goes to the ones who work it," Orville repeated, as though she hadn't heard him the first time, as though repetition might accomplish what logic could not. Wren looked at the house where she had been born 28 years ago. She looked at the porch where her mother had shelled beans in the last summer of her life, sitting in the wooden chair that was now Lenora's, though Lenora had never shelled a bean on it in her life. She looked at the hand plane in her sack and the $4 in the book with its broken spine. Then she picked up the sack, settled the strap across her shoulder, and walked south without saying a word. Words were just sounds. They couldn't hurt her unless she agreed to let them land. She knew the Dechuk, the will her father had supposedly signed, was wrong. He had told her once, sitting on the same porch in the last autumn of his life, that he meant the land to go equally to all three of his children. He'd said it simply, without ceremony, the way he said most true things. She had no written proof of that conversation. She had no money to hire a lawyer in Jefferson City, no standing in Caswick that would convince a judge to hear a young widow's account of a deathbed conversation over a signed document with two witnesses, both of whom belonged to Orville's circle of Saturday night acquaintances. She understood the mathematics of her position with a clarity that had nothing to do with acceptance. This was not a fight she could win today. The question was what she could win, and when, and with what. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her she could still call her. She walked for 2 days along the old game trails that wound through the limestone hills above Harrow Creek, following ridgelines she had memorized in childhood during the Sunday mornings when her brothers slept late and her father was beyond waking and the hills were hers alone. The Ozark Plateau in October had a particular quality of light, pale, clear, stripped of summer's haze, falling through the thinning canopy of scarlet oak and sugar maple onto limestone bluffs that went silver white in the late afternoon. The hollows ran with cold spring water that tasted of iron and rain and something older underneath, something she had no word for but recognized the way you recognize a voice before you remember whose it is. She slept the first night under a rock overhang near the upper fork of Harrow Creek, wrapped in her thin blanket, listening to the water talk to itself in the darkness below. She did not eat. She had no food yet, and the $4 were for survival, not comfort. And she did not yet know where survival was leading her. On the bank of the creek in the morning light, half buried in gravel, she found a piece of limestone with a spiral fossil pressed into its face, a crinoid stem she knew from Dana's, a creature dead for longer than she had language to measure. She held it for a moment, turned it in her finger. Then she put it in her coat pocket without examining why. Some things you keep before you understand the reason. The temperature on the night of the 9th dropped to 34 degrees by her reckoning, which she made by the behavior of the water in a small pool near her campsite, the skim of ice forming at the edges hours earlier than it would on a still night at 40 degrees. The sky had gone the deep purple gray of a bruise above the western ridge. And she was moving faster now, not from fear, but from the practical recognition that she needed shelter that was not a rock overhang and a blanket that had not been adequate for 50 degrees, let alone what the weeks ahead would bring. She was traversing a south-facing limestone bluff above Harrow Creek, maybe 100 feet above the water, when she saw the Virginia creeper. It had gone the color of arterial blood with the season, hanging in a thick curtain across a section of the bluff face that she had walked past once before, years ago, on one of her Sunday wanderings, without examining closely. A massive sycamore grew at an angle from the base of the bluff beneath it, its bark white as bleached bone in the failing light, its upper branches rattling in a wind she couldn't feel at creek level. She pushed through the creeper with one arm raised across her face. The opening behind it was roughly feet high and 10 across, shaped like a flattened arch, as though something immense and patient had pressed its palm into the limestone from inside and held it there for 1,000 years until the rock gave way. She stepped through. The first thing she felt was warmth, not heat, not the blast of a hearth fire or the stifled closeness of a sealed room in summer. Something steadier than either. Something that seemed to come not from a source but from the stone itself, rising out of the walls and floor the way warmth rises from good bread just pulled from the oven, diffuse, unhurried, already present when you arrive. She set her sack down. She stood in the dark and breathed. The air was still, moist, mineral-scented, clean stone, wet earth, the faintest trace of sulfur from somewhere deep in the passage behind her. From farther back in the darkness, she could hear water, a slow and intermittent dripping, each drop striking stone at irregular intervals like a clock keeping time in a language she didn't speak yet. The temperature inside the cave, she estimated, was close to 58 degrees. Outside, the temperature had already dropped below 40 and would keep falling. In 6 weeks, the Missouri Ozarks would see nights below zero. In here, In this pocket of limestone and dark, the stone held its warmth with the patient conviction of something that has been doing this for a very long time and intends to keep doing it. She did not sit down and weep. She did not offer any thanks to any power she could name. She sat down on the stone floor with back against the wall, pulled her knees to her chest, and thought. She had read enough of Dana and of the geological pamphlets she'd borrowed from the Caswick Library over the years to have at least the outline of what she was feeling. Deep cave systems maintained near constant temperatures year-round, regulated by the thermal mass of the surrounding rock. Hundreds of feet of limestone acted as insulation, absorbing summer's heat and releasing it slowly through winter, absorbing wind's cold and releasing it back through summer. The deeper the cave, the more stable the temperature. In winter, that stability meant warmth, the earth holding what summer gave it against what winter wanted to take. In summer, it meant cool. The stone was its own furnace and its own ice house simultaneously, depending on what you needed and when you needed it. The earth kept its accounts differently than people did. It did not forget what it had been given. She sat there for perhaps 20 minutes without moving, feeling the temperature from the stone transfer slowly through her coat and the back of her shirt. Then she opened her sack, took out one of her tallow candles, struck a match from the box in her coat pocket, and lit it. The cave materialized around the flame. The main passage ran back from the entrance for roughly 60 feet before the ceiling dropped and then rose again as it opened into a larger chamber. The walls were pale gray limestone threaded with veins of ochre and rust where iron deposits bled through the rock. Small stalactites hung from the ceiling in the main passage, modest finger length, unremarkable, catching the candle flame and throwing it back in tiny amber points. The air was very still. The flame did not flicker. She explored as far as her first candle would take her that night, which was as far as the main, a rough oval, perhaps 30 feet across and 15 high, its floor smooth in places where water had worked it for centuries. 3 tunnels branched off from the far end of the chamber. She noted them. She would return. She slept on the floor of the main chamber that first night with her blanket pulled to her chin and the candle burned out. She did not dream of Orville or Lenora or the house she had left. She dreamed of nothing at all, and it was the best sleep she'd had since February. She was in Caswick by mid-morning of the 10th, carrying her sack and her $4. The town was not large. A general store, a post office that shared its building with a land surveyor's offices, a church, a livery, a blacksmith, and a scattering of frame houses along a single unpaved main street that the October mud was already working to reclaim. The storekeeper, a man named Hatch, had the look of someone who has spent his life watching people come through his door with varying quantities of money and varying quantities of dignity, and who has developed strong opinions about the relationship between the two. He looked at Wren's worn coat and the creases in her face that had come from 2 nights outdoors and asked if she was passing through. "I'm staying," she said, and offered him nothing more. $4 in Caswick in October of 1881 bought 8 pounds of cornmeal, a pound of salt, a half pound of lard, a box of sulfur matches, half a pound of tallow candles, a coil of hemp rope, a second-hand hatchet with a nick in the blade that Hatch showed her the way you show a person a flaw in something you're hoping they'll overlook, and a tin cup. She carried it all back to the cave in 2 trips. The second one made in near darkness, navigating the last quarter mile up the bluff trail by memory and by the white column of the sycamore catching the last gray light. The first week was light. With the hatchet and a flat stone she used as a striking block, she carved shallow niches into the limestone walls at intervals, following the natural bedding planes of the rock, which she could feel with her fingertips even before she could see them. The stone had its grain, like wood, and it yielded differently along those planes than across them. She set candles in each niche. When she lit them all for the first time on the 4th night, the chamber changed. The limestone caught the flame and held it, threw it from surface to surface in a pale, warm glow that seemed to rise out of the stone itself rather than fall onto it. The stalactites overhead threw shifting shadows that moved when the air moved, as though the cave were breathing in a register she was only beginning to hear. The second task was the wall. The cave's entrance, while sheltered by the overhang of the bluff, admitted wind that came up the creek valley from the south and west. And the temperature differential between the cave interior and the outside air meant that cold came in not just through the opening, but through the dynamic of air exchange, warm cave air rising and flowing out, pulling cold outside air in through the lower portion of the entrance. She had read about this in a pamphlet on mind ventilation borrowed from the Caswick Library 3 years ago, and the principle had stayed with her in the way that useful things do, filed away against a need she hadn't yet imagined. What she needed to do was slow the exchange without stopping it, a partial barrier, leaving the upper portion of the entrance open for light and the ventilation the cave required, blocking the lower portion where the cold air entered fast. She spent 8 days gathering flat limestone from the creek bed below the bluff, carrying stones up the steep path one or two at a time with her arms burning and her boots slipping on loose scree. She fell twice. The second fall opened the skin on her left palm on a sharp edge of flint embedded in the hillside. She wrapped the hand in a strip torn from the hem of her blanket, shifted the load to her right arm, and kept moving. By the end of the 8th day, she had enough stone. She mixed a crude mortar from creek mud, wood ash, and crushed limestone she ground between two rocks into a rough powder, working it with her injured hand until the skin around the cut went tight and hot. She tested the consistency by spreading a small amount on a flat stone and pressing another against it. Not ideal, but it would hold if the stone courses were tight and the wall dried slowly in the still cave air. She laid the first course on a bed of mortar pressed directly onto the cave floor, choosing her stones by weight and flat face length, fitting them together the way she'd seen creek stones fit naturally in the bed below. Not randomly, but with a logic that rewarded patience. The wall rose to 4 feet over 3 days, laid in courses that were not perfectly level but were close enough to hold. She left the upper portion of the entrance open. The effect of the completed wall was immediate and measurable. The draft at ankle level, the cold inflow she'd been feeling for 2 weeks, stopped. The temperature in the main chamber climbed 2 degrees in the first day after the wall dried, a change she registered not by any instrument, but by the behavior of the candle flames, which no longer bent toward the entrance, and by the quality of the air against her face, which was warmer and more still. She built a sleeping platform from cedar poles cut with the hatchet and lashed with rope, raised 18 inches off the cave floor to escape the ground damp that collected on the stone each night. She gathered dried meadow-grass and fallen leaves from the hillside above bluff and packed them 18 inches deep on the platform before spreading her blanket. She fashioned a door for the entrance from woven cedar branches, hung on rope loops from iron spikes she hammered into the mortar joints at the top of the wall. It could be swung open in mild weather, pulled closed and tied against the wind when the temperature dropped. On the night of the 15th of November, the temperature outside fell to 22 degrees. She knew this because she walked outside at midnight to relieve herself, and the cold hit her face like a flat stone, breathtaking and immediate, the kind of cold that makes the inside of the nose ache with each inhale. She went back into the cave and closed the branch door and stood inside and breathed out. Her breath did not cloud in front of her face. She held her palm flat against the limestone wall near the baffle gap she'd left in the lower portion of her first interior experiment. A narrow channel she'd blocked partially with a flat stone to slow the airflow from the deeper passages. The air flowing over her hand was warm. Not dramatically warm, but warm in the way that matters, the way that the difference between 40 degrees and 60 degrees matters when you're sleeping on a where no fire burns. She sat down on her sleeping platform and opened her sack and took out the tin with her mother's $4, 3 of them now, since the purchase in Caswick. She set the tin on the cedar platform beside her. She looked at it for a moment, then she reached into her coat pocket and took out the limestone crinoid fossil from the creek bank. She set it on top of the tin. It sat there in the candlelight, the spiral of a creature that had been dead for 300 million years, smooth under her thumb when she pressed it. She was beginning to understand something about the cave. In the days since she'd arrived, she'd noticed that the Anan she had and found and named the Ninanji, but that she recognized by feeling a faint, consistent movement of air from the deeper passages toward the entrance, a slow exhalation, warm and steady. On colder days when the outside temperature fell further below the cave interior's baseline, this movement was strong. On days when the outside temperature rose, the direction reversed, cool outside air drawn gently inward. The cave was exchanging air with the world above it. Driven by the temperature difference between its interior and the outside atmosphere, the same principle that made a chimney draw smoke upward, warm air rising, creating a flow. But this chimney had been drawing for 100,000 years without fire. If that airflow could be managed, slowed in some places, redirected in others, the heat it carried could be kept inside rather than traded away. She wrote this in her notebook, which was made from folded sheets of brown paper she'd found pressed flat and dry in the bottom of her sack. The paper having been used to reap her purchases is from the Caswick store at some point before her father's death. Her pencil was a stub she'd found on the road between the bluff and town. She sharpened it with her belt knife and wrote in letters small enough to preserve the paper. The temperature she estimated, the direction of the airflow, the approximate width of the gap like she'd left in the interior stone, the change in the candle behavior before and after. She did not know if these notes were science. She knew they were evidence, and evidence was what you gathered when you didn't yet know what question you were trying to answer. Orville's wife, Lenora, was, by that November, generous with her version of the story. At the church, at Hatch's store, along the fence lines where neighbors exchanged news with the leisurely appetite of people who have limited entertainment, she told anyone who would listen that the youngest Pharaoh girl, married barely a year before her husband died, no children, never quite right, had gone to live in a cave up on the bluff above Harrow Creek like a fox gone to ground, not cast out, never cast out. Always turned out as though Wren had chosen this, had declined the generous offer of the family home in favor of a hole in the hillside because of some perverseness of character that had always been there, visible to anyone paying attention. A shame, Lenora said, in a voice that held no shame at all. Only the clean satisfaction of a prediction confirmed. Some people in Caswick felt something closer to pity. An older woman named Edna Marsh, who had known Wren's mother and had watched Wren grow up with the particular attention of a woman who recognizes something in a girl that the girl's own family can't see, left a bundle of dried venison and 2 sweet potatoes at the base of the bluff trail one November morning without climbing up, without knocking, without requiring any acknowledgement. A farmer named Holt Breckett, who lived 3 miles down the creek and whose fences Wren had helped mend the previous spring, offered her work of spling rails through the winter. She declined politely, offering nothing by way of explanation. She had work of her own. Through November and into December, she improved the cave the way she improved anything. By watching it first, long enough to understand how it already worked, and only then intervening. She noticed that the temperature in the deeper portions of the main chamber was consistently higher than near the entrance, even with the wall in place. She noticed that the side tunnel to the northwest, which dead-ended in a pile of fallen rock 40 feet back, had a narrow gap near its seam ceiling where she could feel warm air bleeding out into the hillside. She packed the gap with moss and dried grass. The chamber temperature rose half a degree. She built a low stone baffle across the mouth of the deepest tunnel, the one that dropped slightly as it ran back into the hill, leaving a gap the size of her fist at floor level. The wall slowed the outflow of warm air from the deep passages while still allowing the cave to breathe. She waited 2 days and pressed her palm to the wall at chest height. Warmer. She built a baffle in the tunnel to the east, adjusting the gap size by trial, removing stones, adding them, reading the change in the candle flames and the feel of the air on the back of her hand. She sealed 3 cracks in the ceiling with a mixture of creek clay and fine gravel she pressed into place with her fingers, working by feel in the spaces where the candle couldn't reach. By Christmas of 1881, with 4 inches of snow on the ground outside and the temperature at 11 degrees on the coldest night, a cold that glazed the creek's shallows into opaque white sheets and split the bark on the young sycamores below the bluff with sounds like rifle shots carried up on the still air, the interior of Wren Pharaoh's main chamber held steady at 71 degrees. No fireplace, no stacked cord of wood burning through the night, no iron stove consuming fuel by the hour. The earth warmed her because she had learned to listen to it and had worked carefully with what it offered rather than against what it withheld. She recorded this in her brown paper notebook in small, exact letters. December 25th, 1881. Outside, Est, 11 Fahrenheit. Inside main chamber with Pipus gap heat 71. Yep. No fuel burned for heat. She set the pencil down and looked at what she'd written for a long moment. The winter was hard in other ways. She ate simply, and sometimes not enough. Cornmeal mush thickened with lard, wild game, when she could get it from snares she made from hemp rope and bent iron wire, dried black walnuts she'd gathered in the last warm days of October and stored in the coolest side tunnel. She grew thinner. Her hands cracked along the knuckles from the constant work with stone and cold, the skin splitting and reopening before it could heal, going hard and dark at the edges of each cut. There were nights when the silence in the cave stopped being peaceful and became instead a weight pressing her into the cedar platform, a reminder that she was one woman lone in a hillside, and that no one in the world was obligated to care whether she made it to spring. On those nights, the dripping of water in the far passage sounded less like a heartbeat and more like a clock. She did not allow herself to remain in that accounting for long. Mornings came, they always had. Each morning she woke in a shelter she had built herself from nothing but stone and observation and $4 worth of supplies. And the mathematics of that fact was more powerful than the darkness. And she got up and made cornmeal mush and went back to work. Purpose was a medicine she had not expected. The cave was its own kind of company, patient, indifferent, asking nothing of her except attention. She gave it attention, she gave it everything she had, and it gave her warmth. And that exchange felt in its way more honest than most of the arrangements she had made with people. Spring arrived in the Missouri Ozarks the way it always did, gradually, then with sudden conviction. The dogwood came first along the creek banks, white against the still gray hillsides, followed by redbud and clouds of vivid pink that seemed to me bright to be real after brown and white. Mayapples pushed through the leaf litter. The creek rose with snowmelt and ran brown gold for 2 weeks before clearing to its summer green. Wren emerged from the cave into a world that had gone on without her and appeared entirely untroubled by her absence. She had survived the winter. More than survived, she had a working shelter, a system she understood and could improve, and a brown-papered notebook full of observations that she read back, with the particular satisfaction of someone discovering that what they knew matched what they'd seen. She was thinner, harder, browner from the days spent outdoors gathering wood and checking snares in the winter sun. The cave was warm, dry, structurally sound. The mortar walls had held through freezing and thawing without a single cracked course. The fact system functioned with a reliability that still surprised her when she stopped to think about it, which she tried not to do too often, because surprise was a small luxury and she had work ahead. She took whatever work presented itself, that spring and summer, splitting rails for bracket at last, helping build a plank bridge over a tributary of Harrow Creek, clearing land for a homestead 2 hills over for a family named Aldous who had come from Illinois and underestimated the Missouri Ozarks' opinions on underestimation. She was stronger than she looked. She worked without complaint from first light until she couldn't see to work anymore, then walked back to the bluff in the dark by feel and memory, climbed to the cave, ate whatever she had, wrote in her notebook, and slept. By September of 1882, she had accumulated $13.60, which she held in the clove-scented tin alongside her remaining $2 silver. She spent 12 of it on tools, a proper mason's chisel of forged steel with an edge that held, a 4-pound hammer with an ash handle, a handsaw, a draw knife for shaping cedar poles, a measuring line, a carpenter's square, proper candles in quantity. After a long deliberation in front of Hatch's shelves, walking away twice and coming back, she bought a miner's lamp that burned whale oil, which threw a steady beam that did flicker and didn't gutter in drafts the way tallow candles did. The lamp cost $2.60. She counted the remaining change twice on the walk home. With the lamp, she could see the cave as she had not seen it before. The tallow candles had given her pools of amber light surrounded by graduated dark. The miner's lamp threw a beam, directed, strong, penetrating, that reached into corners she had navigated by touch for 11 months. On the night of the 14th of October, 1882, she took the lamp into the third tunnel, the one that dropped as it went. She had avoided it since October of the previous year, not from fear, but from a practical calculation. She'd had insufficient light, and insufficient light in an unmapped tunnel was an invitation to problems she couldn't afford. Now she had the lamp, she went in. The passage narrowed after 40 feet, the ceiling dropping to 5 feet, then 4.5. She bent her head and kept moving. The walls pressed close enough to scrape both shoulders through her coat. The floor was damp here, slick in places with thin mineral deposits, and she moved carefully, testing each footfall. The temperature was higher in this section than anywhere else in the cave she had yet explored. She could feel it through her coat, could feel the warm air against her face moving with a steadiness that was almost like intention. Then the passage opened. She stopped walking because she had run out of room to walk forward. The beam of her lamp hit the far wall and spread across it, and what it showed her made her stand perfectly still. For a long moment, the lamp held out in front of her at arm's length, her mouth slightly open, making no sound. The chamber was the size of a church nave. The ceiling rose beyond the reach of her lamp beam. She could see its outer extent, perhaps 20 feet up, but not its peak. The floor draped away in a series of natural terraces, each one edged with stone formations. On every surface, walls, ceiling, the fallen boulders on the floor, the columns where stalactites and stalagmites had fused over centuries, crystal, calcite, she would learn later. Dogtooth spar, the miners called it. Sharp, pointed clusters growing in starbursts, some clear as window glass, some honey gold, where trace iron had colored them in formation, some tinged at the outer edges with a pale violet that deepened toward their tips. They ranged from crystals no larger than a grain of rice to formations the size of her fist. And the largest, a cluster in the northeast corner at roughly chest height, was the size of a wash basin, facets grinding light against each other in a cascade she could not look at directly. When she turned with the lamp, the light moved across the formations, and each new angle caught different crystal faces and threw different points of brilliance back at her, so that this chamber seemed to breathe light rather than merely reflect it. The whole room alive with cold fire, with frozen lightning, with something she had no accurate word for, but recognized immediately as the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. Once. She did not make a sound. She did not think about money. She did not think about Orville or Lenora or the 40 acres or the $4 she'd carried away from her father's yard a year ago. She thought of nothing in particular and felt in that thoughtlessness something she recognized only later when she searched for a word for it. Reverence. Not the kind with kneeling and language. The older kind. The kind that comes from standing in the presence of something that has been here much longer than you have, that will be here much longer than you will, and that has no need of your opinion about it. She lowered herself to the stone floor and sat down with the lamp in her lap. The light from the lamp, adjusted slightly by the motion of her sitting, shifted across the nearest wall of crystals and sent a ripple of new reflections cascading from that cluster to the next and the next. A chain of light that traveled the perimeter of the room in less than a second and then held, steady and burning, waiting. She sat there for perhaps 30 minutes. Then she rose, took her lamp, and walked back through the passage to the main chamber, closing the cedar door behind her against the night. She did not write anything in her brown paper notebook that evening. Some things required more silence than words could provide before you could say anything true about them. The winter was coming again. She had work to do. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was the winter she stopped surviving and started building something with a future in it. The distinction mattered. Surviving was a posture, hunched active, spending energy to hold ground already taken. Building was different in the body, different in the mind. It required you to look forward rather than back, to plan for a spring you weren't certain would come for you specifically, to commit resources to a vision that didn't yet exist. Wren had spent 14 months surviving. She understood its disciplines. Now she applied those same disciplines to something larger, and the cave, patient as it had always been, warm as it had never stopped being, held her through the work the way it had held her through the worst of the cold. She returned to the crystal chamber every day through November, not to extract, not yet. She went with her lamp and her brown paper notebook, and she looked the way she had learned to look at the limestone walls before she built anything, long enough, carefully enough, that the object of attention eventually revealed its logic rather than just its surface. The crystals had a logic. They grew in clusters that followed the geometry of the host rock's fracture planes. Each cluster oriented along lines she could trace with her finger from one formation to the next. The whole chamber a record of the directions the water had moved through the limestone for centuries before it became a cave. Some clusters were isolated, growing on detached boulders or on sections of wall separated from the main formations by natural breaks. Others were integral, anchoring nodes that the surrounding growth had organized itself around, structural in the way that certain stones in a wall are structural, the ones you don't pull without consequences you didn't intend. She made maps. In the margins of her notebook pages, then on separate sheets of the brown paper she'd been rationing, she drew the chamber from memory, marking each significant formation with a notation of its size, its color, its relationship to adjacent crystals, whether it was actively growing. She could tell the growing ones by the film of mineral water that clung to their tips, almost invisible in the lamplight, but present to her fingertip when she touched briefly, carefully, the outer points of the smallest formations. The ones that had stopped growing were dry at their tips, sometimes slightly yellowed, sometimes fractured across their points where their own weight had exceeded their base's tolerance. In March of 1883, she wrote a letter. This was not a small decision. Paper cost money she hadn't yet spent on it, and the intention behind the letter required a clarity of purpose she wanted to be certain of before she committed it to word. She had found a reference in the geology pamphlet she'd borrowed from the Kazakh library 2 winters ago to a Professor Emmett Calloway at the University of Missouri in Columbia, a geologist with the State Survey whose work on Ozark limestone formations had been summarized in 3 paragraphs that she had read 4 times and then copied into her notebook because the pamphlet had to go back and she'd wanted to keep the ideas. She wrote to him over 3 evenings, drafting twice on a spare scrap of paper before committing to the final version. She described the cave. She described the baffle piston system and the thermal properties she'd documented across 14 months of observation. She described the crystal chamber in language that she knew was insufficiently technical, but that was as precise as her vocabulary allowed, supplemented by 2 small sketches of crystal habit that she had copied from her notebook maps. She did not ask for anything specific. She explained what she had found and what she had recorded, and said that she would welcome the opinion of someone who knew more than she did about what she was looking at. She sent the letter care of the university's Geological Survey office, walked to Caswick to post it, and returned to the bluff and went back to work. Spring came while she waited. The redbud bloomed along Harrow Creek below the bluff, the same vivid, almost as aggressive pink as the previous spring. And she watched Tim trend in the early mornings with her tin cup of coffee, letting herself feel the particular pleasure of a second spring as something different from the first, not relief that she had survived, but recognition that she was still here, still working, still accumulating the patient weight of days that were building towards something she hadn't finished imagining yet. She was at McCullen's farm on an afternoon in April, trading 4 eggs. She'd kept chickens since January, 4 hens in a small cedar pole enclosure she'd built on the shelf below the bluff for a measure of wheat flour when she first heard the sound of a mason working. It came from the north side of the farmyard, a rhythmic percussion of steel on limestone, 2 taps to find the plane, then a firm strike to follow it. She knew that sequence. She had taught it to herself imperfectly over the past year. Whoever was making that sound knew it the way she did not yet know it, as a reflex, as something the hands did without consulting the mind. She walked around the barn. A man was laying a stone wall along the north face of McCullen's equipment shed, rebuilding what looked like 2 collapsed courses and a failed corner. He was perhaps 35, broad across the shoulders, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have done physical labor long enough to stop spending motion they don't need to spend. He worked without hurry. His hands on the stone had an authority that was not dramatic, only certain. As she watched him set a stone, he turned it 3 times in his hands before placing it, reading something in the faces she couldn't see from her angle. When he set it down, it settled into the course with a finality that required no adjustment. That was not luck. That was someone who knew where a stone wanted to go before he put it there. "You know how to read a fracture plane," she said. Not a question. He looked up. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that she associated, for no clear reason, with people who spent a significant portion of their lives outdoors. He assessed her with the frank, unhurried attention of someone who has learned that a person's hands tell you more than their face. And his gaze dropped briefly to her hands before returning to her eyes. Her hands were the hands of someone who had been working stone and rope and wood for a year and a half. My father built stone churches in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, he said, before he came west. I grew up with fracture planes the way other children grew up with multiplication tables. A pause, not unfriendly. You've been working limestone. I have a project, Wren said. His name was Cormac Veth, widower since 1879. He'd come to Missouri in 1880 following the general westward logic of men who have lost the thing that kept them up in one place and haven't yet found the thing that will keep them in the next. He did stonework for farms throughout Delaware County, walls, foundations, chimneys, the occasional root cellar. He was good at it in the way that people are good at things they learned before they knew they were learning them. The knowledge so early and so deep, it was less a skill than a fact about who they were. She brought him to the cave 2 weeks later, in early May. She watched his face as he came through the entrance, as he ran his hand along the mortar joints of her wall, the first one, the rough one she'd built from creek mud and wood ash. And the expression that crossed his features was not contempt. It was the involuntary response of a trained mason confronting amateur work. A slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional compression of the mouth, the professional reflex that precedes the professional discretion that keeps the reflex from becoming an insult. The courses are closer to level than I'd expect, he said. This was, she understood, a considerable compliment in the specific register of people who work stone. He studied the baffle system with an attention that went beyond curiosity into something closer to the way she had studied the crystal formations, patient systematics, asking questions that revealed he understood the principles before she finished explaining them. How much did the temperature differential drive the airflow? Whether the gap size was fixed or adjustable? What happened to the baffle's effect when outside temperatures were within 10 degrees of the cave interior rather than 30 degrees below it? She had answers for most of these. For two of them, she had observations but not conclusions, and she said so. And he nodded as though this were not a deficiency, but simply the natural boundary of what the evidence so far had been able to show. They began working together in the second week of May. He taught her to dress stone, to work a face flat and true on all four sides, using the chisels and the 4-pound hammer, following the bedding planes the way you follow a river, not fighting the stone's own geometry, but learning it and using it. Her first dressed stone took 40 minutes and was not level on its fourth face. Her fifth took 20 minutes and was close. Her 12th was right. He watched her figure out the sequence without offering instructions she hadn't asked for, which was, she would later recognize, the more useful kind of teaching. She taught him the cave, the thermal logic of it, the way the baffle system worked in concert with the natural convection rather than against, how to read the airflow with the back of the hand in the dark. The difference between the temperature in the main chamber and the temperature in the deeper tunnel that led to the chamber she had not yet shown him. He was a precise and unsentimental learner. He did not express wonder at things that merely surprised him. He reserved that response for things that genuinely exceeded his framework. And when he encountered those, he went quiet in a particular way, a focused stillness, the processing visible in his face before he came back with a question that showed he'd understood what he'd seen. In June, the letter arrived, not from Callaway, but from Orville. She collected it at the Caswick post office on a Wednesday morning, recognizing her handwriting on the outside before she'd fully registered the return address. She had not seen him since October of 1881. She stood at the post office counter and read it without moving. The letter was 3 paragraphs and a close. Holt Brackett, it seemed, had mentioned the cave during a Saturday evening at the Caswick Tavern, not maliciously, only incidentally describing the remarkable woman who'd been living on the bluff above Harrow Creek for 18 months. Orville had been present. He had walked up the bluff the following Thursday. He had stood at the cave entrance. He had looked at the cedar door, the dressed limestone wall, the candle niches, the stacked shelves of her notebooks and tools and stores. The letter did not describe what he had thought. It described what he intended, that the land survey records for Delaware County, if examined, would show that the bluff face where the cave entrance stood was contiguous with Farrow family land. He had consulted a lawyer in the neighboring county. She was occupying, without permission or payment, property that belonged to the family estate. She had 30 days to vacate. She folded the letter. She put it in her coat pocket. She walked out of the post office into the June morning, stood on the unpaved main street of Caswick with the sun in her eyes, and breathed slowly through her nose 3 times. Then she went to find Judge Harlan Poe. Poe kept his office in the back of the county courthouse. A 2-room frame building that had been built in 1871 had the look of something that had been apologizing for its construction ever since. He was 61 years old, spare and deliberate, with the manner of a man who has spent 4 decades listening to people explain why the law should work differently in their particular case. He did not look up when she knocked on the open door. He was reading a document, and he finished reading it before he acknowledged her presence, which she did not take as rudeness. She took it as information about how he allocated his attention. She stated her question precisely, the way she would state an observation in her notebook. Not what had happened, but what the law specified. Under Missouri statutes governing mineral rights, who held claim to mineral formations discovered in a subterranean cavity whose entrance was located on land whose ownership was in dispute between a private claimant and the county's public creek corridor. Poe looked at her then. She saw him register several things in sequence: her age, her clothing, her hands, the specificity of her question. He set down the document he'd been reading. He pulled a different volume from the shelf behind his desk. She waited while he read. The room smelled of paper and cold wood ash from the fireplace in the corner. Through the window, she could see the main street of Kaskaswick, 2 wagons passing each other in the mud, with the careful negotiation of people who knew they'd have to pass each other here again tomorrow. The survey map from 1847. Poe said at last, not to her, but in the manner of a man finding something in text that he wants to be sure he's reading correctly, describes the southern boundary of the Faro land grant as running to the top of the creek bank, not the bluff face, the top of the creek bank. He looked up. A south-facing bluff above a creek constitutes, in standard survey, the creek's natural bank only at its lowest point of elevation. Another pause. I'll need 2 weeks to verify the original survey stakes. She thanked him and left. She did not tell him about the crystal chamber. She did not tell Cormac about the letter when she arrived back at the cave that afternoon. She told him she needed to build the entrance wall again properly this time, dressed stone, Portland cement mortar, the joint work he'd been teaching her. He looked at her face. He asked no questions. He picked up the chisel. They rebuilt the wall over the following week. Where her original construction had been serviceable, the new wall was something else. Courses running true, joints tight and uniform, the face stones smooth enough that rainwater sheeted off them rather than soaking into the mortar. Cormac worked beside her with the focused efficiency of someone who doesn't need to be told what the work is for to do it well. When the last course was set and she pressed the final joint smooth with the back of her finger, he stepped back and looked at it for a long moment. That'll hold 100 years, he said. I know, she said. That was why she'd needed it done. In the 3rd week of July, with the 2-week period she'd given Judge Poe well past, she returned to his office. He had the survey records on his desk. The original 1847 stakes had been located by the county surveyor, one still in place, one reconstructed from offset measurement. The southern boundary of the Faro land grant ran to the top of the creek bank at an elevation of the surveyor had determined 4 feet above the summer water line of Harrow Creek. The south-facing bluff above the creek, the bluff where the cave entrance sat, 100 feet above the water, was not within that boundary. It lay in the unincorporated creek corridor that the county had never formally claimed, but that no private individual had ever been granted. Wren was not on Faro land. She had never been on Faro land. Poe communicated this finding to Orville's lawyer by letter. Orville received the news sometime in August. Wren heard nothing from him directly. She did not expect to. In September, Professor Calloway arrived. He came on a Tuesday, riding up from Caswick on a hired horse with 2 leather saddlebags and the expression of a man who has been told to expect something interesting and has learned, from long experience, that what people call interesting rarely is. He was 53, gray-haired, with the academic's habitual slight stoop and the field geologist's contrary habits of alertness and endurance. He had replied to her letter in May. She had gotten the letter in late May, almost too late to respond before he'd scheduled his fall survey circuit, and had agreed to include Delwick County in his itinerary. She led him up the bluff without preamble, through the entrance, past the main chamber where he paused to examine the baffle system with a hand held into the airflow from the gap, asking nothing yet, through the narrowing passage, through the squeeze, into the crystal chamber. Calloway stopped walking. He raised his lamp. The beam caught the nearest dog-tooth spar cluster and detonated outward through the room in a cascade of reflected light that traveled the perimeter of the chamber and came back again before it faded. He stood for a long time without speaking. "Good Lord," he said at last, and the condescension she had half expected was entirely absent from his voice. What was there instead was the sound of a man discovering that the world is larger than his current map of it. He spent 3 hours in the crystal chamber. He measured formations with a tape. He sketched crystal habits in his field notebook with the quick, accurate line of a man who has been doing this for 30 years. He chipped small samples with her permission, working at the edges of isolated formations she'd already identified in her notebook as expendable. And he looked at each chip through a hand lens, tilting it toward the lamp, and his running commentary shifted over the course of that 3 hours from professional descriptions to something less guarded. The dog-tooth spar formations, he told her, were among finest he had encountered in the state, possibly in the entire Ozark region. The crystal habit was exceptional. The clarity in the clear specimens was remarkable for this geological context. The violet specimens along the back wall, she had marked them in her notebook as possibly amethystine quartz, were confirmed by his hands lens as exactly that. And the presence of amethystine quartz in association with calcite spar in a formation this intact was, in his professional estimation, unusual enough to be genuinely significant. He came back to the main chamber and looked at the baffle system again. He held his palm over the gap in the lower baffle for a full minute, reading the airflow. He pressed palm flat against the wall at shoulder height, reading the temperature stored in the stone. He asked her the same questions Judge Poe had not asked, not what had happened to her, but what she had observed and when and how she'd recorded it. She showed him the brown paper notebooks. He read through 3 months of entries without speaking. "You've been maintaining a living space at 71 degrees through an Ozark winter without burning fuel for heat," he said. His voice had the careful flatness of a scientist who wants to be sure he's stating observed fact rather than interpretation. "71 in February," she said. "73 if I close the vent entirely. The air becomes stale after 2 days." He sat down on the cedar chair she'd made in her first winter, still solid, still level, and shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in the particular way of someone recalibrating. "What you've worked out through observation," he said. "The thermal mass management, the convective control, the natural insulation of the formation, these are principles that engineers in Europe are beginning to describe in formal terms. You're not aware of that literature, which means you derive these principles independently from evidence. That's not a small thing." She said nothing to that because she didn't know what to do with it. Cormac, standing in the passage entrance with his arms folded, allowed himself a brief, private expression that she caught in her peripheral vision and did not comment on. Calloway wrote his report for the Missouri Geological Survey over the following 2 weeks. He also wrote a letter to a mineral dealer in St. Louis named Aldous Keene, describing the crystal specimens and their quality and language that, given his habitual restraint, amounted to urgency. Keene's response arrived at the Caswick post office in October, care of Miss W. Farrow, which was how she'd given Calloway her name, old habit, the married name feeling recently like something she was still deciding whether to keep wearing. Keene offered prices 3 times before she believed them. A clear dog-tooth spar cluster of specimen quality, $8 to $15 depending on size. Amethystine quartz of the quality Calloway subscribed $30 for a fine example, possibly more, depending on the collector. She put the letter in her coat pocket alongside the limestone crinoid she still carried, and she climbed back up the bluff to the cave. And she stood in the entrance and looked out over Harrow Creek in the October light, the same light as 2 years ago, the same scarlet oaks going crimson on the opposite ridge, the same pale sky, and she did not rush to the crystal chamber with a hammer. That was not her way, had never been her way. What she did instead was go to the crystal chamber that evening with her lamp and her notebook, and she sat in the center of the room on the flat-top boulder she'd cleared for exactly this purpose. And she looked at the formations again, not as inventory, but as she had always looked at them, with the long, unhurried attention of someone who understands that the first obligation before taking anything from a place is to be sure you understand what you're taking and what will remain. She identified 7 formations that oceans that met her criteria. Isolated, non-structural, their removal would leave no gap in the chamber's essential character. 3 clear dogtooth spar clusters of varying size. 2 smaller mixed mineral formations. 2 sections of the amethystine quartz from the back wall, separated from the main deposit along a natural fracture line she had traced with her fingertip 100 times without yet touching a tool to it. She went back to the main chamber and sharpened her thinnest chisel on the whetstone she'd bought in June. She cut 3 wooden wedges from a cedar branch, patting their faces with strips of old blanket. She made a wire saw from twisted steel wire she'd been saving for a specific purpose without knowing yet what it was. Cormac came the next morning. She showed him the tools. He looked at them, then at her face, then at the entrance to the 3rd tunnel. Now, he said down. Now, she said. They worked through the morning with a quietness that wasn't silence so much as shared concentration. Kind that collects between 2 people who are doing something that requires more care than words can accommodate. She set the chisels. He read her placements and adjusted 2 of them with a fingertip, not correcting but refining. And she let him because his hands knew things hers were still learning. Each extraction took between 20 minutes and an hour. The wire saw through the amethyst section took 90 minutes of steady, careful work, both of them taking turns, so the pressure remained even throughout. When the first section came free, a violet-tipped cluster the size of a large fist, intact, points unbroken, she held it in both hands in the lamplight and turned it slowly, watching the facets catch the beam and multiply it. And Cormac watched her face rather than the crystal. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. They packed the specimens that afternoon in cotton batting she'd been buying from Hatch in small quantities since August, not explaining the purpose. She'd sewn the batting into protective sleeves the previous week. Each specimen went into its sleeve, then into a wooden crate she'd built from split pine lined with sawdust she'd been drying for a month. She wrote the labels in her neatest hand, noting the location of each specimen within the chamber, its dimensions, its mineral composition as best she could determine, the estimated growth orientation. The notes she'd understood from Calloway's reaction to her notebooks were not secondary to the specimens. They were part of what she was selling. October brought the bats back to the cave entrance at dusk, the small brown species that she'd coexisted with since the first autumn, their emergence each evening a reliable marker of the hour. October also brought Orville. He came on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of the month, climbing the bluff trail alone, without his lawyer, without Gerald, without Lenora. She was on the ledge above the entrance, checking the cedar door's upper hinge, which had worked loose in a windstorm the previous week when she heard boots on the scree below. She watched him climb without calling down to him. He was breathing hard by the time he reached the ledge, which was not surprising. He had not maintained himself in the years since she'd last seen him. The land had taken more from him than he'd anticipated, the way it always did from people who viewed it as a resource rather than a relationship. He stood at the far end of the ledge from her, not approaching the cave entrance. He looked at the new wall, the dressed limestone courses, the mortar joints she could see him trying to read. "I heard you won the land question," he said. "The survey records were clear," she said. She went back to tightening the hinge with a wrench. It wasn't a question of winning. He was quiet for a moment. Below them, Harrow Creek ran low in the October drought, its sound barely audible from the ledge. "The lawyer said you had a geologist report," Orville said. "Professor Calloway from the University Survey. He was here in September." Another silence. She finished with the hinge and tested the door's swing solid. "You're doing all right then?" Orville said. The statement contained several questions he wasn't asking, and she had no intention of answering questions that hadn't been asked. "I'm doing well," she said. The distinction was one she made deliberately, and she let it stand in the air between them without elaboration. He looked at the cave entrance one more time. Then he turned and went back down the bluff the way he'd come. She watched him until he disappeared below the limestone outcrop that marked the path's first switchback. Then she turned back to the door, tested the hinge once more, and went inside. Cormac was in the main chamber, mixing a fresh batch of mortar for the baffled phalanx refinements she'd been planning. He looked up. "Your brother," he said. "He came to look," she said. He looked. She picked up her chisel. "We should finish the north baffle before the temperature drops." The night of the last Thursday in October arrived with no warning that distinguished it from any other October night until it didn't. The barometric pressure had been falling since noon. She'd been watching the behavior of the candle flames, which flattened southward as the pressure dropped, a habit she'd learned to read over 2 years. But she'd seen pressure drops before that came to nothing. This one came to something. The wind arrived at 9 in the evening, not gradually but all at once. A wall of sound that hit the bluff face and turned into something physical against the stone. She felt it in the cave as a change in the air pressure against her eardrums before she heard it above the entrance. By 10 o'clock, the wind was driving rain horizontally up the creek valley, and by 11, the rain had become ice, sleet hammering the limestone face of the bluff with a sound like gravel thrown against a window, steady, punishing. The temperature outside fell 30 degrees in 4 hours. Cormac had left at 4 in the afternoon. She was alone. She checked the cedar door first. The upper hinge she'd tightened that afternoon held. The lower hinge was pulling away from the mortar joint. The wind pressure against the door was enormous, the door flexing inward with each gust. She braced it with a cedar pole wedged between the door's center rail and the baffle wall behind her. The pole held. Water was coming in not through the door but around it, running down the bluff face and finding the gap at the door's lower edge where the terrain sloped slightly inward. She packed the gap with rags, then with creek mud she'd been storing in a bucket in the side tunnel for patchwork. The mud was cold and she worked it with her hands until they went numb, and then she worked with numb hands because the work was not finished. By midnight, the water entry had slowed to a seep. The wind outside had reached a pitch she had no reference for, not a sound she could describe but a physical pressure felt in the chest, the kind of sound that makes you understand that weather is not a condition but a force. She sat on her sleeping platform with a candle burning on the wall niche at eye level, watching the flame. In the cave, it barely moved. The baffle system was holding the interior pressure stable. The temperature had dropped 2 degrees from its normal 69, where it usually held at 71 but no further. Around her, through the walls, she could feel the limestone. Not literally, but the way you feel the presence of something large and calm when you're frightened and it isn't. Hundreds of feet of it in every direction, dissolves into a salt the way it had absorbed every storms since before there were people to name them, unmoved, unimpressed, keeping its own temperature in the dark. At 2 in the morning, the wind dropped, not gradually. In the cave, she heard it go. The register of sound that had been pressing against the stone for 5 hours simply stopped, replaced by the relative silence of hard rain without wind, which after the previous hours felt like quiet. She sat for another 20 minutes to be certain. Then she lay down on her platform, with her boots still on, pulled the blanket to her chin, and was asleep in less than a minute. She was outside on the lead in the gray early light when Cormac came up the trail. His coat was dark with creek water from crossing the ford below. Harrow Creek had risen in the night, running bank full, carrying the debris of the storm's work upstream. He looked at her sitting on the ledge with her tin cup, and then he looked at the new mud packing around the door's lower edge, and then at the door itself, still on both hinges. She held out the tin cup. He took it, sat beside her on the limestone, drank. Below them, the creek ran fast brown, carrying broken branches and the occasional plank from somewhere upstream. The opposite ridge was stripped of its last leaf. The morning was cold and clear, in the way mornings are sometimes clear after violent nights, as though the storm had scoured the atmosphere and what remained was very pure. I was going to come back last night, he said. The ford would have been unsafe, she said. There was nothing to come back for. He looked at her face. Then he looked out at the creek. Keene will be expecting the shipment before winter closes the roads, he said. I can take it to the freight office in Caswick this week if the crate is ready. The crate is ready, she said. She took the cup back, drank the last of the coffee, which had gone cold while she held it. Below them, the creek carried a long pine branch past the base of the bluff, spinning slowly, moving with the certainty of water that knows exactly where it's going. The crate went to Caswick on Friday. The draft from Aldous Keene arrived in 6 weeks. She collected it from the post office on a gray Tuesday in December, walking the 9 miles in frozen mud that grabbed at her boot soles with each step. She stood at the post office counter and unfolded the bank draft. She read the number, $94. She folded it again. She put it in her coat pocket beside the crinoid fossil and the letter from Keene and the current page of her brown paper notebook. She walked back to Caswick's small lumber yard and stood in front of their inventory for a long time, figuring in her head. Then she went to find Cormac. Cormac was at the livery in Caswick when she found him, replacing a broken spoke on his wagon wheel with the methodical patience of a man who fixes things because things break, and breaking is not a reason to stop using them. She stood beside the wagon and told him the number. He set down the spoke and looked at her. 984, he said. For 8 pieces, she had 7 specimens of spar and 1 amethyst section. He was quiet for a moment, doing the same arithmetic she'd already done. Then he picked up the spoke again. What do you want to build? She had the list in her coat pocket. She'd been writing it in pieces since September, adding items when she thought of them, crossing out what she decided she didn't yet need, arriving at something that was less a wish than a blueprint. Pine lumber, planed and dried, proper masonry tools to replace the improvised one, window glass, real glass, not oilcloth, a cast iron cook stove with a pipe collar, bags of Portland cement and hydrated lime, hinges and nails in quantity, a door lock with a proper mechanism, the kind that required a key. She read the list to him. He listened without interrupting. That's a house, he said. That's what I mean to build, she said. They hired a teamster with a mule wagon to haul the materials up the creek road to the base of the bluff. It took 2 trips over 2 days in December before the ground froze entirely. And the stacking of materials at the bluff's foot, pine stacked and covered with oilcloth against snow, cement bags wrapped and weighted, the stove crated in the teamster's packing, took most of an afternoon in cold that made the breath come out in long white plumes and the fingers go clumsy inside their gloves. She paid the teamster $1.50 for both trips, which he accepted without comment, though he looked at the bluff and at the materials and back there with the expression of a man who has been hired to do stranger things and hasn't decided yet whether this qualifies. She spent that winter designing, not in the way of an architect with paper and instruments, but in the way she had always designed things, by studying what was already there and understanding what it was offering before she decided what to add. The bluff face itself was the back wall. The cave entrance, centered in the south face, would become the house's interior passage to the cave system behind. The ledge where she had been sitting with her morning coffee for 2 years was large enough for a 2-room footprint if she extended it slightly to the east by shoring up the slope with a retaining wall. The cave's thermal system, the baffle network she'd spent 2 winters refining, would continue to operate behind whatever walls she built, the warm air still moving through the stone, still maintaining the interior temperature the limestone had been maintaining for 100,000 years before she arrived. The construction began in March of 1884, when the frost left the ground and the limestone could be quarried cleanly again. They worked 6 days a week from first light until the light failed, Cormac teaching as they went, not lectures, but corrections delivered in the moment when her chisel angle was wrong, or her mortar was too wet, or her corner course needed to be rebuilt because it was 2 degrees off plumb, which would matter in 6 more courses even if it didn't matter now. She rebuilt the corner without complaint. She rebuilt it correctly the second time, and he moved on without acknowledging the difference, which was its own acknowledgement. The exterior walls went up in dressed limestone, the same dense, fine-grained stone as the bluff itself, quarried from the slope above where the formation was thickest. The faces Cormac dressed had a smoothness that caught the afternoon light and held it in a way that her rougher attempts didn't. And she studied his work the way she had studied crystal formations, trying to understand not just the technique, but the principle behind it. Why a stone faced on all 4 sides rather than just the visible one? Why the mortar joint was tooled concave rather than flush? Why the cornerstones were selected for length before size? Each answer led to another question, and he answered those too, not impatiently, the way her father had answered questions about the land, because the knowledge was worth passing and there was no reason to keep it. They built the cook stove chimney into the rock face itself, chiseling a channel through 6 feet East limestone to reach the bluff's upper face where the moat could exit without now fouling the cave entrance. This took 4 days and destroyed 2 chisels. She bought 2 more from the Caswick hardware and kept going. The chimney drew perfectly on the first fire she lit in the stove, the smoke pulling upward through the limestone channel, with a conviction that made her set her hand near the stovepipe and feel the draft. Cormac watched her check it and said nothing, which was how she knew he was satisfied. Window glass went in last, two windows on the south face, oriented to catch the winter sun, and one on the east face for the morning light she'd been doing without for 2.5 years. When she set the final pane and the light came through it and lay in a clean rectangle on the pine floor she'd sealed with pine tar the previous week, she stood in it for a moment with her hands at her sides. Real light, contained, directed, domesticated. She had not realized until that moment how much she had missed windows. The house was finished by the end of July 1884. Two rooms of dressed limestone with glass windows, and a plank floor, a cast iron stove. A proper door hung on iron hinges with a lock that required a key she kept on a length of cord around her neck. The bluff as its back wall. The cave system behind it, still breathing, still warm, its baffles still holding the temperature it had held since October of 1881. The ledge below was leveled with a retaining wall and paved with flat limestone she'd dressed herself, and from it the valley opened south for miles. Harrow Creek threading through the tree line below, the opposite ridge was going blue in afternoon haze. She stood on that ledge the evening the last stone was set and looked at what they had made. It was not a grand structure. It was not meant to be. It was a structure built for its site, from its site, using principles the site had taught her. It would last because it understood the ground it stood on, and the ground would hold it in return. It was Cormac who broke the silence first, and what he said was not about the house. "I've been building a place of my own," he said, 2 miles down the creek on the Aldous Road. Started the foundation in May. He paused, looking out at the creek. "I built it with 2 rooms and a kitchen because I was deciding something while I built it, and I wanted to have decided before I said anything about it." She looked at him. He was still looking at the creek. "The east windows are wrong," he said. "I put them facing southeast when they should face due east for the morning light. I realized it in June and kept building anyway, because I thought perhaps it was a question I should ask before I finished." "You should rebuild the east wall," she said. He turned to look at her then. "I should rebuild it with someone who knows which direction the morning light comes from," he said. She considered him for a long moment. The creek below, the light going gold on the opposite ridge, the cave behind them breathing in its slow, patient way. "That's a reasonable way to ask," she said. They married in October of 1885, in the front room of the limestone house, with Judge Poe officiating and Holt Beckett and Edna Marsh as witnesses. Edna wore her church clothes and brought a jar of apple butter she'd put up in September and set it on the windowsill without ceremony. Wren wore a dress she'd sewn herself from blue wool she'd bought in Harrison, the fabric the color of Harrow Creek in the flat light before rain. Cormac wore a clean shirt and new boots, and the expression of a man who has made a decision he is certain of, which looked on his face almost exactly like his ordinary expression, only warmer somewhere behind the eyes. Judge Poe shook her hand afterward, which was not what she'd expected. He held it a moment longer than a handshake required. "I looked at the wrong things at first," he said. "I want you to know I know that." He released her hand and picked up his hat and left because he was a man who said what needed saying and stopped when it was said. She watched him go down the bluff trail and thought that was among the more valuable things she'd seen a person do. The winter of 1884 into 1885, before the wedding, had been the one that changed the town's accounting of her. The cold that year came in earnest in November and did not relent. Temperatures below zero for stretches of 2 weeks. The creek freezing shore to shore. The roads closing in drifts that the county's road crew couldn't clear faster than the wind rebuilt them. 3 families in the Caswick area lost children to the cold that winter. Not to cold directly, to the infections and fevers that followed sleeping in houses that couldn't hold heat, wood supplies exhausted before February, families burning furniture by March. She went to the town council in January. She brought her brown paper notebooks, 3 years of thermal observations, baffle diagrams, temperature records. And she spread them on the council table and explained, without ceremony, what she had learned about the relationship between stone mass, air management, and retained heat. Not the cave specifically. The principles the cave had taught her applied to ordinary frame construction. A house did not need a cave to hold heat through a Missouri winter. It needed mass on the north wall, earth banked against the foundation, windows oriented south, ventilation managed rather than ignored. None of this required money most of these families didn't have. Some of it could be done to existing structures before spring. Three council members listened with polite skepticism. One, a man named Aldous, the same Aldous she'd helped clear land for 2 years earlier, listened with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her notebooks, and at the end asked two precise technical questions that told her he'd understood what she'd said. Judge Poe was not on the council, but he was sitting in the back of the room, and when the council's skeptical murmuring reached a pitch that suggested they were going to thank her and send her home, he stood up. "I have been in that cave," he said in February, 71 degrees with no fire burning. He sat back down. The council voted to allow her to speak to the county's building community the following month. She spoke to 11 men in the back room of the Caswick Hardware. 7 of them came to the bluff afterward to see the cave themselves. By the following winter, 2 of them had banked earth against the north walls of houses they'd built for clients, and one had rebuilt a foundation with the air gap she described. And both reported back to her, not effusively, not with the language of converts, but with the straightforward acknowledgement of craftsmen whose results had confirmed a theory. The thermal principle worked. She had said it would. In September of 1886, Ida was born. The birth was uncomplicated, attended by the midwife from Caswick, who had been attending births in Delwick County for 30 years, and approached the profession with the unhurried competence of someone who has seen every variation and been surprised by none of them. Cormac paced the front room for 4 hours. The midwife sent him to the ledge to wait. He went. When the midwife opened the door and told him he could come in, he crossed the room in 3 steps and stood looking, pinking at the child in Wren's arms with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the focused calm of his working face, not the quiet warmth of his ordinary face, but something unguarded, something that had no professional register, that was simply feeling without management. Ida was small and loud, and had Cormac's gray-green eyes and Wren's habit of looking at new things very carefully before deciding what to do about them, which became apparent within the first few weeks, and which Wren recognized with a recognition that went deeper than pride. The climax of the inside kind, the kind that happens when no one is watching, that produces no outward evidence and requires no witness, came on a December night when Ida was 3 months old. Cormac's mother had come down from Ohio in November to help through the winter, sleeping in the east room, rising at night when Ida awoke so that Wren could sleep. But on this particular night, Wren woke before the child cried, the way mothers sometimes do, the body outrunning its reasons, and she was already lifting Ida from the cradle when the first sound came. She carried Ida to the cedar rocking chair Cormac had built her in the weeks before the birth and sat down and settled the child, and the room was quiet except for the small sounds of feeding and the sound of the cave behind the wall, that faint, patient exhalation, the limestone giving back what summer had given it. Outside, she could hear snow. She couldn't see it. It was dark. But she could hear the particular silence of snow falling, the way it muffled the ordinary sounds of the valley below. The temperature in the room was 71 degrees. She knew this not from any instrument, but from the quality of the air on her arms, on Ida's face, the same quality she had learned to read in 3 winters of careful attention. She looked at Ida's face in the dark. She didn't need a candle. The child was close enough to find by warmth alone, and felt the small hand close round her little finger with the grip that newborns have, involuntary, absolute, the grip of something that is not yet learned to hold back. For the first time since October of 1881, since the yard of the Faro homestead with the $4 and the cracked hand plane and the brothers on the porch, she was not holding anything back either, not calculating, not building toward the next thing or defending against the last thing or measuring the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. She was simply here in a house she had built, on a bluff she had claimed, in warmth that the earth itself maintained, holding a child who would inherit whatever she managed to make of all of this. The cave breathed behind the wall. The snow fell outside. Ida's hand relaxed by degrees as she fell back towards sleep, the grip loosening without releasing. Wren did not cry. She did not make any sound. She sat in the chair Cormac had made for exactly this, and felt the full weight of what she had built settle around her, not triumphantly, not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of stone that has found its resting place and stopped moving. Some things hold. That is all they need to do. Professor Calloway returned in May of 1887 with a younger colleague named Brewster who carried instruments Calloway not had in 1883. calibrated thermometers in both scales, a mercury barometer, a surveyor's transit, a camera apparatus on a folding tripod with glass plates, and a chemical kit. Brewster photographed the cave entrance, the baffle system, the main chamber, the crystal formations in the third passage, and Wren herself standing in the cave entrance with one hand resting on the dressed limestone of the doorframe, looking out at Harrow Creek in the morning light. She didn't know she was being photographed until the shutter fell. Calloway told her afterward that he'd asked Brewster to take it because he wanted a record of who had found the cave and what finding it had cost her. Calloway's formal measurement confirmed what her brown paper notebooks had recorded across 5 years. The deep passages held 56 to 58 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The main chamber with the baffle system functioning averaged 68 to 73 degrees depending on season and vent configuration. The crystal formations were in excellent condition, actively growing in the sections she had not extracted from, showing no sign of the disturbance that careless extraction would have caused to adjacent formations. He sat on the ledge with her that evening while Cormac made coffee inside, and Ida slept in the east room and told her what he intended to publish. A monograph on the cave's geothermal properties, citing her notebooks as the primary observational record. A separate paper on the crystal formations, noting the quality and the extraction methodology she developed. You should know, he said, that what you did in the winter of 1881 to 1882, the baffle system, the thermal management, the documentation is going to be recognized eventually as something more than ingenuity. There are engineers at universities in the East who are working toward these principles from the theoretical direction. You arrived at them from the other direction. From evidence, the cave had been doing it for 100,000 years, she said. I only learned to stop interfering with it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd seen on his face in the crystal chamber for 4 years ago. The recalibration expression, the map expanding expression. That, he said, is precisely the insight that will take the engineers another generation to arrive at. Orville died in February of 1889. She received the news from the postmaster in Caswick on a gray Tuesday, handed across the counter in an envelope from a lawyer in Jefferson City handling the estate, which was not, the letter implied, a significant one. The 40 acres were mortgaged. The soil was exhausted. Lenora had gone back to her family in 1887, taking what she could carry. Gerald had not been heard from in years. She walked home through mud frozen at the surface and soft beneath, the kind of walking that takes concentration. She climbed the bluff. She stood on the ledge above Harrow Creek in the February cold and looked out at the valley for a long time without going inside. She had expected, at some point over the years, to feel something particular when this news arrived, some version of the vindication she'd been owed since October of 1881, some settling of the account. What she felt instead was simpler and less satisfying and more honest than any of those things. A sorrow that was not grief, not personal loss, but something closer to the feeling she sometimes had, looking at the exhausted tobacco fields visible from the upper ridge, land that had been asked too much, too soon by people who couldn't see past the next season. Orville had inherited the house and the good stove and the oak table and the family name and the community's goodwill. And he had spent all of it with understanding that spending and consuming are not the same thing. He had not known how to look at what he had and ask what it was willing to give. He had only known how to take. She walked to Caswick the next morning and paid for the headstone from her own account at the Harrison Bank, local limestone, properly dressed, carved by a stone cutter in Caswick she had recommended to two other families. Orville Farrow, 1845 to 1889. She did not add anything else. She did not attend the burial. There was no one there who would have wanted her to come. And she did not go to places where she was not wanted for the sake of a gesture that would mean nothing to anyone, least of all herself. Ida grew into herself with the particular confidence of a child who has been shown, from the beginning, that the world rewards attention. By the time she was 4, she knew the cave's passages well enough to navigate the main tunnel without a lamp, her hands reading the walls the way her mother had taught her. She drew the crystal formations in charcoal on brown paper, the same brown paper Wren's original notebooks had been made from. And the drawings had a quality that went beyond childlike copying. She was capturing not just the shape of the crystals, but the way light moved through them, the internal logic of the facets. something she understood intuitively before she had any language for it. Garrett arrived in 1888, 2 years after Ida, with Cormac's broad frame and his tendency toward action over commentary. He was, from the beginning, a builder, stacking stones on the ledge at 2 years old with an instinctive sense of balance that made Cormac watch him with the suppressed pride of a man recognizing his own grammar in another person's sentence. By the time he was 4, he was dressing small stones with a scaled-down chisel Cormac made for him, and the faces he produced were closer to level than they had any right to be. Rose came in 1891, the questioning one. She asked why the cave was warm when outside was cold, why crystals grew on walls but not on floors, why water made different sounds over different stones. Wren answered every question with the full answer, not the simplified version, because she believed that children who were given incomplete answers learned to stop asking. Stone remembers what it absorbs, she told Rose one afternoon in the kitchen when the child had asked why the walls felt warm even without the stove burning. Air doesn't hold onto anything. Stone does. Rose turned this over in her mind with a visible effort, a child finding a new piece fits the shape of what she already knows. By the early 1890s, word of the cave had spread in a way that genuinely unusual has spread, slowly, through people who had seen it, telling people who would value knowing. Calloway's published monograph had brought inquiries from geologists at universities in St. Louis, Chicago, Columbia. Keene in St. Louis had been selling heroic specimens to private collectors and university mineral collections for 7 years. And the provenance notes Wren sent with each shipment, her careful records of location, mineral composition, extraction date, formation context, had become, as Calloway had predicted they would, part of the value. People were not just buying crystals. They were buying the knowledge of a woman who had spent 11 years watching a single cave with unfailing attention. She still extracted on the same terms she had set in the winter of 1882, sitting on the flat boulder in the center of the crystal chamber with her lamp and her notebook, deciding what the cave could afford to give before she touched a tool to any of it. The chamber had not diminished. The formations she had taken were replaced over years, new growth along the same fracture planes, slower than any human impatience could track, but present to the eye that knew where to look. On a December evening in 1893, she brought Ida into the crystal chamber for the first time at night. Ida was 7, old enough to carry a lamp without being told twice not to tilt it, old enough to understand that the chamber required a particular quality of attention she already knew how to give. They sat side by side on the flat boulder in the center of the room, their 2 lamps making the crystals ring with light in every direction. Ida said nothing for a long time. Wren let the silence be what it was. "Did you know it was here the whole first year?" Ida asked at last. "No," Wren said. "I was too busy staying warm to go looking. But then you found it." "Then I had a better lamp," Wren said, "and I went far enough back to see what was there." Ida looked at the formation nearest her, a cluster of clear dogtooth spar at eye level, points catching the lamplight and distributing it in 12 different directions. She didn't touch it. She had never touched the formations without being told she could, which was a restraint Wren had not needed to teach explicitly because Ida had arrived at it herself through looking at things carefully long enough to understand that some things you hold with your eyes. "What if you'd stopped before the squeeze?" Ida said. "Narrow section of the passage where the ceiling dropped and the walls closed in." "Then I'd have a very warm house," Wren said, and no idea what was behind it. Ida thought about this with the visible seriousness she brought to things that mattered. "So you have to go past the part that's uncomfortable," she said. Wren looked at her daughter's face in the lamplight, at the gray-green eyes reading the crystals with the same focused patience she'd seen in her father's face above a stone he was trying to understand. "Every time," she said, "without exception, spring came early to the Missouri Ozarks in 1894, the dogwood blooming 2 weeks ahead of its usual calendar, the red bud so close behind that for 3 days both were open at once along Harrow Creek, white and pink together against the gray-brown understory. Wren was 41 years old. She was not old in the way the word gets used carelessly. She was seasoned, the distinction her mother had once made, explaining the difference between timber that has sat too long in weather and timber that has cured correctly. One is damaged, the other is stronger than it started. She walked into the crystal chamber alone on a March morning before the household woke, carrying her lamp. She had been doing this since the winter of 1882, walking into the chamber in quiet hours, looking at what was there, noting what had changed, what had grown, what had fallen. 11 years of these visits, the chamber looked the same. It always looked the same. That was its nature, operating on a timescale that made human consistency look impulsive. She moved to the northeast corner, where the largest formation stood, the wash basin-sized class cluster of clear dog tar spar that she had to mark up her first notebook as the anchor of the room, the formation she would never extract from, the one the chamber organized itself around. She raised her lamp. The crystals caught the beam and detonated it in the room, point to facet to face to wall, the chain of light traveling the chamber's perimeter the way it had traveled it. On the first night she'd stood here with a miner's lamp that had cost $2.60 and changed everything. She set her hand against the formation, not the crystal points, those she had always been careful with, but the calcite matrix at its base where the spar cluster met the limestone wall, where the cave's mineral-laden water had been depositing and depositing and depositing for longer than she had a number to name. The stone was cold under her palm, not the warmth of the living chambers behind her, but the deeper cold of something still becoming, still working in its own direction, at its own pace. She held her hand there for a moment, felt the stone's patience through her palm. The absolute geological patience of a thing that measures time in deposited molecules and has never been in a hurry because it has never needed to be. Then she took her hand away. She picked up her lamp. She walked back through the narrowing passage, through the squeeze, through the main chamber where the baffle system moves its slow, warm air from the white depth toward the entrance, and out through the door into the March morning on the ledge above Harrow Creek. Below, the creek ran clear and cold in the early light, the dogwood on the far bank just beginning to think about opening. Behind her, through the limestone walls, the cave breathed. It had been breathing since before any pharaoh had ever stood on this bluff, and it would keep breathing when the last pharaoh's name had passed from memory. She stood in the morning and listened to it. Then Ida called from inside, something about breakfast, about the fire needing wood, and Wren turned toward the door, toward the voice, toward the day's particular work, which was different from yesterday's and would be different from tomorrow's, but was, in all the ways that mattered, the same.